The conference room was packed with 23 people when my boss, Warren Steele, finished his PowerPoint slide and said the words that knocked the breath completely out of me. After careful consideration, we've decided to give the Senior Operations Director promotion to someone with closer strategic alignment to our leadership vision. He paused, letting those words sink in while I sat frozen in my chair. Then he gestured toward his college friend Trevor, who sat at the far end of the table wearing a smile that was equal parts smug and uncomfortable. And Erin's role will be adjusted downward to better utilize her technical strengths. Someone laughed. Actually laughed. A nervous sound that cut through the thick silence. My ears started ringing. I felt the conference table edge digging into my palms as I gripped it hard, trying to anchor myself to reality. This wasn't a mistake or miscommunication. This was deliberate. This was a public execution disguised as a business decision, delivered in front of the entire operations department, including people I'd trained, mentored, and led for 3 years. I'd been expecting congratulations. Instead, I got humiliation served cold in front of colleagues who'd been sending me congratulatory messages just days ago. Warren continued talking about team structure and reporting changes, but his words became white noise. All I could process was the horrible realization that this announcement had been planned, staged, and executed to maximum effect. Chairs scraped against the floor as the meeting ended. People gathered their laptops and notebooks, avoiding eye contact with me like I'd suddenly become contagious. A few offered sympathetic glances that felt worse than nothing. Warren clapped his hands together once, sharply, like the meeting had been a rousing success. "Thanks everyone for your flexibility during this transition," he said, his eyes landing on me deliberately. "Erin especially, thank you for your understanding and team-first attitude." My throat was too tight to speak. I managed a small nod, my lips pressed into a line so hard they hurt. My heart pounded against my ribs like it was trying to escape my chest. Inside, something fundamental was hardening, crystallizing from the soft tissue of trust and loyalty into something cold and sharp. I didn't cry though every instinct screamed to. I didn't speak though 1,000 furious words crowded my throat. I stood slowly, gathered my notebook and phone with hands that trembled slightly, and walked out of that conference room with whatever remained of my dignity wrapped around me like armor. Behind me, I heard Trevor's voice asking Warren about timeline details. Ahead of me stretched the long hallway to my desk, where I'd have to sit and pretend everything was fine. I made it to the bathroom first, locked myself in a stall, and let myself shake for exactly 2 minutes before forcing myself to breathe normally again. My name is Erin Walsh, and until that conference room announcement, I'd been the senior operations lead at Northbridge Solutions, a mid-sized tech consulting firm. For 3 years, I'd been the person who fixed broken product launches when engineering and sales couldn't communicate. I'd trained half the operations department, developed the workflow systems we still used, and stayed late countless nights when everyone else went home to their families. I'd mentored junior staff who now held management positions themselves. I'd salvaged client relationships when projects went sideways. I'd been promised, explicitly and repeatedly, that the senior director role was mine when it opened up. And now I'd been demoted publicly, in front of people I once supervised, while Warren's college buddy, who'd been with the company for exactly 8 months, got the position I'd earned. Trevor had nice credentials on paper, sure. MBA from a decent school, experience at a competitor firm, the kind of polished resume that looked good in board presentations. But he didn't know our systems, didn't understand our client base, and had never successfully led a major project from start to finish at Northbridge. None of that mattered apparently. What mattered was his friendship with Warren, forged during their fraternity days 20 years ago and maintained through golf outings and alumni networking events I'd never been invited to. I sat at my desk after the meeting, staring at my computer screen without seeing it. Then the memories started flooding back with painful clarity. 6 weeks ago, Warren had called me into his office. He'd closed the door, lowered his voice to that confidential tone that made you feel included in something important, and told me the senior director role would be mine. "It's already in motion," he'd said, leaning back in his expensive chair with the satisfied expression of someone delivering good news. Just need a few approvals from above, but those are formalities. You've earned this, Aaron. Nobody works harder or delivers more consistently than you. I'd believed him completely. Why wouldn't I? I'd spent 3 years proving myself, exceeding every expectation, sacrificing personal time for company success. The next day, congratulatory emails had started arriving. Subtle but unmistakable. Looking forward to working with you in your new capacity. Excited about the direction you'll take the department. Well-deserved recognition of your contributions. They'd been real, those messages. I'd saved them, responded to them, let myself feel the validation I'd worked so hard for. I'd started planning how I'd structure my new team, which initiatives I'd prioritize, how I'd handle the increased responsibility. I'd believed his promise because trusting your boss's word seemed like basic professional functioning. How incredibly naive I'd been. Trevor settled into my old office, the one I'd occupied for 2 years, like he'd always belonged there. The movers came the same afternoon as the announcement, relocating my belongings to a smaller workspace near the copy machines while Trevor's boxes went into the corner office with windows. I watched from my new desk, maintaining a neutral expression while something burned in my chest. 2 days later, Trevor appeared at my smaller workspace with a coffee in hand and an awkward smile. "Hey Aaron, got a minute?" His tone was friendly, oblivious. "I'm still getting up to speed on how operations works here. Warren suggested you'd be the best person to walk me through the key systems and client relationships." The audacity was breathtaking. They'd demoted me publicly, then expected me to cheerfully train my replacement. I looked at Trevor's expectant face and made a decision in that split second. "Of course," I replied, my voice professionally pleasant. "What specifically do you need to know?" For the next hour, I showed him exactly what he asked for. System logins, file locations, meeting schedules. Nothing more, nothing less. I answered his questions directly and completely, but I didn't volunteer additional context, didn't explain the unwritten relationships and informal processes that made everything actually work. I gave him the manual without the interpretation, the map without the shortcuts. He left satisfied, thinking he'd gotten what he needed. He had no idea what he hadn't gotten. That night, I sat alone at my kitchen table with my laptop and a notebook. The anger that had been burning since the conference room had transformed into something colder and more focused. I could confront Warren, demand explanations, make emotional appeals about fairness and broken promises. That approach would accomplish nothing except making me look unstable and giving them justification for their decision. Or I could do something different, something quieter, something that would matter. I opened a new folder on my computer and titled it simply, Documentation. Then I started organizing. Every email Warren had sent about my promotion. Every project I'd successfully led. Every metric showing my team's performance. Every piece of evidence demonstrating my qualifications versus Trevor's lack of experience. I created a spreadsheet tracking my responsibilities against my new reduced pay grade. I saved copies of performance reviews, client testimonials, and internal recognition. I wasn't sure yet how this documentation would matter, but some instinct told me facts would be more powerful than feelings. If they wanted to create a story about why Trevor deserved my promotion, I'd build a competing narrative using timestamps, data, and indisputable evidence. I worked until midnight, organizing 3 years of contributions into clear, chronological, impossible-to-dismiss records. When I finally closed my laptop, I felt something I hadn't felt since the conference room. Control, purpose, plan. The emails kept coming and I saved every single one. Tasks that were clearly above my new pay grade and outside my reduced responsibilities. "Aaron, can you lead the Mitchell client recovery?" "Aaron, we need your expertise on the Weber implementation." "Aaron, can you create the Q4 strategic framework?" Each request contradicted the supposed rationale for my demotion, that my strengths were purely technical and I wasn't ready for strategic leadership. If that was true, why were they still assigning me strategic work? I responded to every request professionally, completed every task with my usual excellence, and documented everything meticulously. Date received, scope of work, level of responsibility. I created a second spreadsheet comparing my actual ongoing responsibilities against Trevor's. The pattern was damning. I was still doing senior director level work while being paid and titled as a mid-level lead. Trevor was attending meetings and reviewing my work while contributing little of substance. The paper trail grew heavier by the day, and I felt its weight like armor. Every email, every project assignment, every request for my expertise was evidence that their public justification for demoting me was false. They needed my leadership. They just didn't want to compensate or credit me for it properly. I wondered how long they thought they could maintain this arrangement before the contradiction became visible to others. I watched Trevor struggle without me covering his gaps, and I did nothing to help beyond what he explicitly asked for. In his second week as senior director, he missed a critical deadline on the Pearson account because he didn't understand our quality review process. Warren asked me quietly to help get things back on track. I did professionally, visibly, and entirely in writing. I sent Trevor a detailed email outlining the exact steps needed, copied Warren and the project stakeholders, and documented my recommendation with timestamps. Trevor followed my instructions and recovered the situation, then presented the solution in the next leadership meeting as his own problem-solving. I said nothing, but I noticed Warren's eyes flicker toward me briefly, some awareness registering that the rescue had come from elsewhere. The third week, Trevor made a commitment to a client that our systems couldn't support. I'd caught similar mistakes before they became problems, using my years of experience to flag impossible promises before they reached clients. This time, I waited until Trevor had already sent the commitment email, then forwarded it to Warren with a single line. FYI, this timeline isn't technically feasible with current infrastructure. Let me know if you need detailed analysis. Warren called me immediately, stress tight in his voice. The client was now expecting something we couldn't deliver, and Trevor hadn't consulted anyone before making the promise. Could I fix it? I could, and I did. But every fix was documented, every solution was credited to me in writing, and the pattern was building. The turning point came during a department-wide video meeting 3 weeks after my demotion. We were reviewing the quarterly results, and Warren was explaining why certain metrics had declined. Part of the challenge, he said smoothly, looking at notes on his desk, has been delays in the transition process. Aaron's handoff of critical projects wasn't as thorough as we'd hoped, which created some knowledge gaps. Heat flooded my face. I felt multiple colleagues' eyes turn toward me through their camera squares, assessing, wondering. Warren was blaming me for problems created by Trevor's inexperience and his own bad decision-making. The accusation was carefully worded, plausible enough to stick, vague enough to be hard to refute. My hand moved toward the unmute button. Every instinct screamed to defend myself, to list the exhaustive documentation I'd provided Trevor, to call out this lie publicly. But I stopped. I glanced at my calendar, at my email folders, at the spreadsheets I'd been building. The meeting invitation was time-stamped. Warren's claim was recorded in the meeting minutes. And I had 3 weeks of documented evidence proving I'd provided thorough handoffs, detailed training, and ongoing support. I kept my face neutral and stayed muted. Let him lie. Let the lie become part of the official record. Later, I downloaded the meeting recording and transcribed Warren's exact words, adding them to my documentation folder with the date and meeting context. Truth had timestamps. Lies had consequences. I just needed to be patient. 2 days after the video meeting, I received an unexpected email from HR asking for a casual check-in to discuss my transition. The meeting was framed as routine, but the timing felt deliberate. Sheila Bennett from HR met me in a small conference room with a sympathetic expression and a notepad. "How are you adjusting to your new role responsibilities?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. I considered my response carefully before answering. "The adjustment has been interesting," I replied calmly. "I'm finding that my day-to-day work hasn't changed significantly from what I was doing before the transition." I'm still leading complex client projects, providing strategic direction, and training senior staff. The main difference is the title and compensation, not the actual responsibilities. Sheila's pen paused over her notepad. Can you give me some examples? I pulled out my laptop and showed her my responsibility tracking spreadsheet. Current assignments with dates, project scope, leadership level required, compared against my official job description. The contradiction was stark and undeniable. I'm happy to forward you the documentation if it would be helpful, I offered. Sheila nodded slowly. That would be useful for our records. I sent the spreadsheet immediately after our meeting, along with select email threads showing the gap between my demotion rationale and my ongoing assignments. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't complain. I simply provided facts. 3 days later, Sheila scheduled a follow-up meeting. This time, her questions were more specific. Erin, were you ever formally promised the senior director role before the announcement? The question hung in the air, loaded with implications. I could downplay Warren's promises as misunderstandings or informal conversations not meant to be taken seriously. That would make everything easier, less confrontational, more politically comfortable. Or I could tell the truth. Yes, I said clearly. In a one-on-one meeting 6 weeks before the announcement, Warren explicitly told me the role was mine pending formalities. I received congratulatory emails from several colleagues after that conversation, suggesting the decision had been communicated more broadly. Sheila made careful notes. Do you still have those emails? I opened my laptop and forwarded the entire thread. Warren's initial meeting summary where he'd written, "Excited to move forward with your promotion to senior director." My thank you response. Congratulatory messages from 4 colleagues referencing my upcoming new role. Follow-up exchanges about transition planning that referenced my imminent promotion. The timestamps told a clear story. Warren had promised me the role explicitly and repeatedly. Then he'd given it to his friend without explanation. The room went very quiet as Sheila reviewed the emails on her phone. Finally, she looked up. Thank you for providing this. Would you mind waiting outside for a moment? I need to make a call. I stepped out of the conference room and stood in the hallway, my heart pounding. Something was shifting. The documentation I'd been building carefully and quietly was becoming something more than personal record keeping. It was becoming evidence. That evening, Warren cornered me in the parking garage as I was leaving. His friendly facade had cracked, revealing the pressure underneath. Erin, I heard you've been talking to HR about the transition, he said. His voice tight and controlled but carrying an edge I'd never heard before. I want to make sure you're not overcomplicating what was really a straightforward business decision. I stopped walking and faced him directly. I've been answering HR's questions honestly. They asked about my current responsibilities and the timeline of the promotion process. I provided factual information. You need to be careful about creating problems where none exist, Warren continued, stepping closer in a way that felt deliberately intimidating. I know you're disappointed about how things worked out, but spreading discontent and questioning leadership decisions isn't going to help your career here. I'm still the one who signs off on your performance reviews and compensation. Remember that. The threat was barely veiled. Fall in line, stay quiet, or face retaliation. My stomach tightened with a mix of fear and anger. But I'd come too far to back down now. I understand, I replied calmly, keeping my expression neutral. Is there anything else you wanted to discuss? Warren studied my face, trying to read whether his warning had landed. Just think about what I said. I nodded once and walked to my car. As soon as I got home, I documented the entire conversation while it was fresh. Date, time, location, Warren's exact words, the threatening tone. Then I sent myself a summary email, creating another timestamp. His attempt at intimidation had just become more evidence. The investigation expanded rapidly over the following 2 weeks. People I'd never met from finance and compliance started requesting records. Meeting invitations appeared on my calendar from department heads, asking about specific projects and decision processes. Trevor stopped making eye contact when we passed in the hallways. Meetings happened without me but clearly about me. I could see them on shared calendars, could sense the nervous energy in the office. Something I'd set in motion quietly was now rolling forward with its own momentum. I continued my work normally, professionally, excellently. I met every deadline, exceeded every expectation, and documented everything I did. My performance was impeccable, giving them no excuse to claim the demotion had been justified by work quality. Sheila called me for a third meeting, this time with another HR representative present. "We've been reviewing the timeline around the senior director promotion decision," she began. "We're finding some inconsistencies in the process that concern us from both a fairness and compliance perspective." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "We need to ask you for a complete timeline of events related to the promotion, including any relevant communications or promises. Would you be willing to provide that?" Would I be willing? I'd been building exactly that for a month. "Yes, absolutely," I replied. "I can have that to you by end of day tomorrow." That night, I organized everything into a single, comprehensive document. The timeline was devastating in its clarity. 6 weeks of explicit promises from Warren. 3 weeks of congratulatory communications from colleagues. The sudden pivot to Trevor with no explanation. My demotion delivered publicly for maximum humiliation. The continued assignment of senior director responsibilities without senior director compensation or credit. Warren's false statements blaming me for transition problems I'd thoroughly documented. His threatening conversation in the parking garage. I included everything chronologically with supporting evidence. Emails, meeting notes, project assignments, performance reviews. I wrote in neutral, professional language, stating facts without emotional commentary. I didn't need to editorialize. The evidence spoke clearly enough. Looking at the completed document, I felt the weight of recognition. This wasn't just about a promotion anymore. It was about a pattern of leadership misconduct, favoritism, retaliation, and dishonesty. I'd stayed loyal to Northbridge for 3 years, given up weekends and evenings, sacrificed personal relationships for company success. I'd believed that dedication and excellence would be rewarded. Instead, I'd learned the hardest possible lesson. Loyalty without leverage was just vulnerability. I submitted the document the next morning, then went back to work like nothing had happened. But everything was about to change. HR scheduled what they called a formal review meeting for the following week. They asked me to bring any additional documentation I thought might be relevant. I arrived with a folder organized chronologically, tabbed by topic, with printed copies of key emails and project records. The folder was 3 inches thick, representing 3 years of contributions systematically documented. Sheila was there, along with 2 other HR representatives and someone from legal whose presence made the meeting's seriousness undeniable. They asked me to walk through my timeline. I did calmly and methodically. I didn't embellish or interpret. I simply presented facts with supporting evidence. Warren's explicit promises. The congratulatory emails proving those promises were communicated broadly. The sudden reversal with no explanation. My public demotion. The ongoing assignment of work above my new pay grade. Warren's false statements about transition problems. His threatening conversation. Each claim was supported by documented evidence. Emails with timestamps, meeting recordings, project assignments, witness statements from colleagues who'd congratulated me on the promotion that never materialized. The HR team took notes, asked clarifying questions, and reviewed the physical documents carefully. The legal representative was particularly interested in Warren's parking garage comments, asking me to recount the conversation 3 times to ensure consistency. "Is there anything else you think we should know?" Sheila asked finally. I paused, then shook my head. I think the documentation speaks for itself. 2 days later, everything changed. I arrived at work to find Warren's office dark and his assistant looking stressed. Rumors spread quickly through the department. whispered in break rooms and sent via private messages. Warren had been placed on administrative leave. Trevor had been temporarily reassigned to a different project pending review. Executives I'd only seen at company-wide meetings were suddenly present in our department, asking questions, reviewing files, conducting private interviews. The office buzzed with nervous energy. People started treating me differently. Carefully, respectfully, like I'd suddenly become someone who mattered. Some colleagues approached privately to tell me they'd been questioned about the promotion timeline and had confirmed my version of events. Others avoided me entirely, unwilling to be associated with what was clearly becoming a significant company crisis. I continued working normally, maintaining my professional composure even as everything around me shifted. Inside, I felt a complicated mix of vindication, relief, and exhaustion. I hadn't sought to destroy anyone. I'd simply insisted on being treated fairly and documented when I wasn't. The fact that documentation had led to this level of investigation wasn't my doing. It was the natural consequence of leadership misconduct meeting factual evidence. A week into Warren's administrative leave, I was called into a meeting with the Vice President of Operations, someone 3 levels above Warren in the company hierarchy. The room suddenly felt very serious. The Vice President, Victoria Hayes, didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Aaron, I want to start by apologizing on behalf of Northbridge's leadership. The investigation into your situation has revealed serious concerns about process integrity, favoritism, and retaliation. These issues don't reflect our company values, and they're not acceptable at any level." She paused, letting those words settle. "Warren Steele has been suspended pending the completion of our internal review. Based on what we've found so far, his position with the company is unlikely to continue. Trevor Morrison has been reassigned to a project management role more appropriate to his actual experience level. He won't be returning to the senior director position." My heart pounded, but I kept my expression neutral. "I appreciate you telling me. There's more," Victoria continued. "Our review has documented a pattern of favoritism in Warren's decision-making that extends beyond your situation. We found other instances where qualified internal candidates were passed over for Warren's personal network connections. Your documentation brought this pattern to light." She looked at me directly. "What happened to you was wrong. We're taking steps to ensure it doesn't happen again." 2 days later, Warren's administrative leave became permanent termination. The official announcement cited violation of company policies regarding fair promotion processes and abuse of managerial authority. Trevor resigned before any formal decision about his status was announced, accepting a position at another company rather than face the awkwardness of his situation becoming public knowledge. Victoria called me into another meeting, this time with Sheila and the head of compensation. "Aaron, we'd like to offer you the senior director role, effective immediately. You'll receive full back pay from the date of the original announcement, adjusted to reflect what you should have been earning. We'll also issue a formal apology and correction in the next department meeting." For a moment, it felt like the ending I'd been fighting for. The promotion I'd earned, publicly restored, with compensation made whole. But as I looked at Victoria's carefully rehearsed apology and Sheila's relieved expression, I realized something. This wasn't really about making things right. This was about containing damage, preventing lawsuits, and moving past a PR problem as quickly as possible. They wanted me to accept this offer, be grateful for the justice, and help them sweep the whole situation under the rug. I asked a single question that I could tell they hadn't expected. What's being done to prevent this from happening again? Not just policies on paper, but actual structural changes to how promotions are decided and how concerns are addressed. The room went quiet. Victoria exchanged glances with the others before responding carefully. "We're reviewing our processes and will implement improvements." It was a non-answer, the kind of corporate language that promised everything while committing to nothing. I realized then that accepting this offer meant returning to a department where this had happened, reporting to new leadership who would always see me as the person who'd caused problems, working alongside colleagues who'd witnessed my public humiliation. I'd won the battle, but the war was already poisoned. The formal review concluded 3 weeks after Warren's termination. The final report documented multiple instances of favoritism, procedural violations, and retaliation. Warren had given preferential treatment to at least 4 friends and former colleagues over more qualified internal candidates during his 5 years managing the operations department. My situation had been the most egregious, but it wasn't isolated. The report confirmed Warren had explicitly promised me the senior director role in writing and through multiple conversations with witnesses. His decision to reverse that promise and give the position to Trevor had violated company policy requiring transparent promotion processes. His subsequent attempts to blame me for transition problems and his threatening conversation in the parking garage constituted retaliation. All of it was documented, investigated, and confirmed. The investigation's findings were made available to department leadership, though not publicly released to protect privacy. Several people told me confidentially that the report had been damning, that Warren's termination had been inevitable once the full pattern emerged. Trevor's resignation had been encouraged rather than forced, a face-saving exit that spared him formal discipline. The company implemented new policies requiring promotion decisions to be reviewed by multi-person committees rather than individual managers. They created clearer processes for reporting concerns about favoritism. On paper, they'd fixed the problems my situation had exposed. But I knew organizational change was slow and often superficial, more about avoiding liability than creating genuine fairness. Warren attempted to contact me once after his termination, leaving a voicemail that oscillated between self-pity and blame. "I hope you're satisfied with destroying my career," he said, his voice bitter. "I made one mistake in judgment, and you couldn't let it go. You had to burn everything down rather than be a team player." I deleted the message without responding and sent the transcription to HR and legal. Even in defeat, he couldn't acknowledge what he'd actually done wrong. It hadn't been one mistake in judgment. It had been a pattern of favoritism, broken promises, public humiliation, continued exploitation of my work, false accusations, and retaliation. My documentation hadn't destroyed his career. His own actions had, built systematically over years and finally exposed when he targeted someone who'd kept records. Trevor sent a brief email apologizing for any role I played in a difficult situation. The apology was vague, passive, carefully worded to avoid admitting actual wrongdoing. He'd accepted a promotion he hadn't earned over someone who had benefited from his friend's misconduct, and now wanted credit for acknowledging it was difficult. I didn't respond. Some apologies weren't worth accepting because they missed the point entirely. The real damage wasn't the promotion itself. It was the casual cruelty of public humiliation, the arrogance of assuming I'd quietly accept unfairness, the belief that personal connections mattered more than actual competence. That couldn't be apologized away with corporate politeness. Victoria called me to her office with a formal offer. Senior Director of Operations, effective immediately, with back pay calculated from the date Warren should have promoted me 4 months ago. The apology would be delivered at the next department meeting. My name would be cleared publicly. Everything would be made right officially. I looked at the offer letter, at the title I'd worked 3 years to earn, at the salary that represented fair compensation for my contributions. Then I thought about returning to a department forever marked by this conflict, working with colleagues who'd witnessed my humiliation and Warren's fall, reporting to new leadership who'd always view me as the person who'd caused upheaval. "I appreciate this offer," I said carefully. "But I'd like to propose an alternative. What if I transferred to a different division at the same level, with comparable authority, but in a space without this history? A clean slate where my work can speak for itself without the weight of what happened here." Victoria's surprise was visible. "You'd rather transfer than take back your rightful position?" "I'd rather move forward than stay stuck in the past," I replied. "I earned this level. I want to work at this level. But I want to do it somewhere I'm not defined by a fight I never wanted to have." We negotiated for an hour. Finally, Victoria agreed. I'd transfer to the Client Solutions Division as Senior Director of Strategic Operations, a newly created role with significant autonomy and direct executive reporting. Same compensation, better growth potential, completely fresh environment. I'd start in 3 weeks. On my last day in the operations department, I walked past Warren's empty office. The nameplate had been removed, leaving 2 screw holes in the wall and a rectangle of slightly darker paint where it had hung. His assistant had been reassigned. His files had been boxed and relocated. It was like he'd never existed, erased as thoroughly as he'd tried to erase my contributions. I felt no triumph looking at that empty office. No satisfaction in his downfall, just a kind of quiet closure. This chapter was over for both of us. Some colleagues organized a farewell lunch that felt more like a wake. People were subdued, uncertain how to address what had happened. A few thanked me privately for exposing problems they'd experienced but never reported. Others maintained careful distance, unwilling to be associated too closely with controversy. One junior analyst I'd mentored 2 years ago approached me quietly. "What you did, documenting everything, staying professional, letting the facts speak, that taught me more about handling workplace issues than anything in my business degree." Thank you. That conversation mattered more than any corporate apology. I hadn't just fought for myself. I demonstrated that systematic unfairness could be challenged through careful documentation and professional persistence. That power could be checked by truth. That staying calm and honest was stronger than yelling or quitting or burning bridges. I cleaned out my desk, said my goodbyes, and walked out of that department for the last time. My new role in client solutions felt like landing in a different company. The team was smaller, more collaborative, less political. My manager, Felix Torres, had reviewed my history and addressed it directly in our first meeting. "I know what happened in your previous department," he said plainly. "I read the investigation summary. What I care about is your work, which is consistently excellent. I expect you'll bring that same excellence here, and I'll make sure your contributions are recognized appropriately." "Deal. Deal," I replied, feeling tension I'd carried for months finally release. The work was challenging and visible. I led the redesign of our client onboarding process, reducing timeline by 40% while improving satisfaction scores. I developed strategic frameworks that 3 other departments adopted. I mentored junior staff who actually valued the guidance and credited me publicly for their growth. Decision-making processes moved faster here. My input was solicited and implemented. My voice carried weight in leadership discussions, not because I'd fought for it, but because I'd proven my competence and it was naturally recognized. People listened when I spoke, not because they had to, but because I consistently provided valuable insights backed by solid analysis. 6 months into the new role, I received an innovation award at the company-wide meeting. Victoria presented it, publicly acknowledging my strategic contributions. I accepted the recognition calmly, professionally, without referencing the past. That chapter was closed. This was my present, earned through actual work rather than restored through corporate crisis management. A year after Warren's termination, I'd built something solid in my new division. My team had grown to 8 people. Our client retention rate was the highest in company history. Our strategic frameworks had been adopted company-wide. I'd been promoted again, this time through legitimate process with zero controversy, to Vice President of Client Strategy. The promotion felt completely different from the one Warren had promised and stolen. This one was earned transparently, decided by committee review of documented contributions, announced straightforward without drama. Nobody questioned whether I deserved it. The evidence was clear. I thought sometimes about that conference room where Warren had demoted me publicly, about the ringing in my ears and the laughter that had cut through shocked silence. That moment had felt like an ending, like the destruction of everything I'd built. Instead, it had been a beginning. The beginning of learning to value documentation over trust. The beginning of understanding that loyalty must be mutual to matter. The beginning of recognizing that sometimes fighting back means staying calm, staying honest, and letting the truth speak louder than favoritism ever could. I hadn't won by yelling or quitting or burning bridges. I'd won by being meticulous, patient, and unshakable in my commitment to facts. By refusing to let emotion override strategy. By documenting everything and trusting that truth, given time and proper channels, would prevail over lies. Looking back now, I understand what that experience taught me about power, justice, and professional survival. Being replaceable was never actually about me. It was never about my competence, my contributions, or my value. It was about Warren believing he could act without accountability, that personal connections mattered more than merit, that loyalty was something subordinates owed upward but leadership didn't owe downward. He thought I was replaceable because he'd never faced consequences for treating people as expendable. He thought favoritism was acceptable because he'd gotten away with it before. He thought I'd accept humiliation quietly because that's what people usually did. He was wrong about all of it. The documentation I'd built methodically over months hadn't destroyed him. His own pattern of misconduct had, accumulating over years until someone finally had the evidence and determination to expose it. I'd just been the catalyst, the one who refused to disappear quietly. What I'd learned was this: accountability isn't optional, even though many leaders act like it is. Documentation is power, especially for people without institutional authority. Truth matters, but only when it's preserved and presented systematically. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't fighting loudly. It's staying calm, staying accurate, and trusting that facts eventually outweigh favoritism. I drove away from Northbridge's headquarters that final evening as vice president, the title displayed on my new business cards. I'd earned it twice, once through years of excellent work, and again through refusing to let that work be erased. Both victories mattered. Both had cost something. And both had taught me that being irreplaceable means documenting your value so thoroughly that no one can pretend it doesn't exist.